Dear students, welcome back. This is the second lesson on techniques of data collection. This lesson is on interview. We'll look at the different types of interview techniques used by sociologists. This course is based on the Cambridge O-Level syllabus Sociology 2251. You are expected to consider the strength and limitations of interview and make an assessment of the usefulness of the method in sociological research. To help you navigate through the lesson, here are some pictures used in this presentation. You should understand what they mean. The picture with the lady with the magnifying glass is used for the definitions. The smiley face is used on the slides addressing the advantages of the method. The one with triangle, which signifies danger, is used on slides addressing the disadvantages of the methods. The one with the question mark is used for further clarification. In this lesson, we will look at structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, and focus group interviews. We start with structured interviews. What is the structured interview? In a structured interview, questions are standardized. Structured means similar questions are asked in the same order and replies are coded to produce quantitative data. You should be aware by now that structured interviews are used mostly by positivists who are concerned with the production of quantitative data. There are some practical considerations with the structured interviews which you should be aware of. The time and day are fixed beforehand with mutual consent between the interviewer and the interviewee, that is the person being interviewed. The interviewer can explain the purpose of the research to the interviewee. In this way, the interviewer is more likely to get a good response from those who agree to be interviewed. The interviewer may also clarify certain terms and questions so as to ease the interview process and to ensure that the interviewee understands the questions being asked. What are the advantages of structured interviews? A structured interview is easy to administer as it has a determined set of questions and suggested answers to choose from. It is less time consuming to administer compared to the other forms of interview. We'll address semi-structured and unstructured interviews, which are more conversational types and therefore more time consuming. The response from a structured interview can be easily quantified and presented in a statistical form. This is possible as questions are structured and pre-coded, very much like a questionnaire. It has a high reliability because it can be easily repeated and verified. We will address the concept of reliability in another lesson. Suffice here to know that it concerns the ability to replicate the method of data collection used by the researcher. Let us now address the disadvantages of structured interview. In a structured interview, the answers are restricted to the alternatives provided by the researcher. The interviewee cannot add his views or perception, though this would be enriching for the researcher. This is why interpretive sociologists do not like such structured interviews which relies solely on questions decided beforehand. Interpretive sociologists argue that it is not possible to understand the reasons behind the action of people through a structured interview. The sociologist gets a limited idea of the problem, but she is not able to seek clarification. A structured interview lacks validity. The responses are restricted to the alternatives provided by the researcher, despite the fact that the answers may not fit the exact views of the respondent. Validity, as we explained in a previous lesson, refers to whether the researcher is able to discover the reality that he seeks to discover through the research. We'll address validity in more detail in another lesson. And finally, in some cases, a respondent may simply lie, again affecting the validity of the research. Let us now look at another form of interview, the semi-structured interview. A semi-structured interview, as the name suggests, is not fully structured. You should ask yourself, what is semi-structured about the interview? We use the term semi-structured to suggest that all the questions are not structured beforehand. The researcher starts with a few predetermined questions, but allows the conversation to flow freely around topic of interest as the interview proceeds. It is up to the researcher to ensure that the interview is focused on the topic of the research. What are the advantages of semi-structured interviews? In a semi-structured interview, it is possible to seek additional information and clarification from the respondent, which is not possible with structured interviews. This increases the validity of the findings. That is, the researcher is able to get better understanding of the subject she is researching. The interview is not limited to few structured questions. Often, after talking to people, the researcher gets additional hints on directions that should be explored, adding to the validity of the research. The sociologist can explore deeper meanings behind the behavior and action of people by engaging in conversations that allow clarification and probing. It allows the researcher to get closer to the respondent and gain her confidence and cooperation, which is sometimes not possible in a one-off structured interview. We have a very interesting example of the feminist researcher Anne Oakley. She drew attention to how she got closer to her research subjects, as the method allowed her to come closer to women respondents and get their confidence as a researcher. A semi-structured interview allows lengthier conversation. It is easier to verify and cross-verify ideas compared to a structured interview with fixed questions. We did point out in another lesson that interviewees open up after some time and feel more confident to reply in such interviews. You must have recognized that I compared the semi-structured interview with the structured one so as to develop your understanding of what it is and how it works. Let us now consider the disadvantages of semi-structured interviews. You must have realized by now that every method has some disadvantages because there is no one method which is applicable for everyone. So the disadvantages of semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews cannot be quantified. You must have guessed that this is a criticism from the positivist. The positivists prefer more structured interviews as it provides data that can be quantified. They disagree with the use of semi-structured interviews and unstructured interviews that cannot be quantified. Next, the semi-structured interview relies too much on the ability of the researcher to conduct the interview. Researchers with little experience cannot easily conduct such interviews. The semi-structured interview may lack objectivity, as a lot depends on the interpretation skills of the researcher himself, which may be subjective. The researcher may be tempted to interpret the findings on the basis of her own beliefs and values. However, researchers are quite concerned and careful and are trained to avoid such subjectivity. Another problem with semi-structured interview is that it is difficult to carry out as it requires careful coding and analysis. These are not straightforward processes. Careful coding and analysis are not easy and need training. You must have guessed that semi-structured interview can be very time consuming. It requires the cooperation of the respondent, which is not always easy to ascertain. This is why it needs to be explained and consent obtained for the respondent to agree to devote enough time for the interview. It may also happen that some people will not tell the truth or speak frankly to the researcher. Feminist researchers have shown that men interviewing women is often difficult, as women may not be comfortable with men when they are required to speak frankly about themselves. This type of interview lacks reliability. That is, it cannot be replicated, verified, and checked by another researcher, as it is the case with structured interviews. The conversation style does not lend itself to replication and verification. We now look at unstructured interview. In an unstructured interview, the sociologist does not start with any question, but she is clear about the topic around which a conversation will take place. She has the responsibility to maintain the conversation in line with the objectives of the research, or else the conversation may go in directions not relevant for the research. You must have guessed that this technique requires very good interview skills. The advantages of unstructured interviews. The advantages of unstructured interviews are very much the same as those of semi-structured interviews. The interpretive sociologists who are not concerned with statistical data or generalization to a larger population, unstructured interview provides deeper understanding of a small context. Unstructured interviews have higher validity for the interpretive sociologist. That is, it helps them to get better understanding from the perspective of the persons the sociologist is researching. The disadvantages of unstructured interviews are very much the same as the semi-structured interviews. They cannot be quantified, they are time consuming, they may lack validity, the skill of the researcher is very important and quite difficult to conduct, and so on. So we won't dwell on this lengthily here. Please go back to what we said earlier about semi-structured interviews. Let us look at another form of interview, a focus group interview. It is an interview of a group of people together who share common characteristics and who can contribute together to understanding of a particular issue. It is called focus group because it is an interview that will address an issue with a dedicated group of people who share common characteristics. For example, a group of students or a group of workers in a factory. The method allows respondents in a group to support each other's idea or even agree or disagree, so that the researcher is able to get a better idea of the issue being studied from diverse people at the same time. When can a researcher use a focus group interview? The focus group interview is particularly useful to get initial ideas on the problem at the start of a research. A positivist sociologist interested in quantitative method may use focus group interview to get information in order to proceed further with the development of other tools of data collection, for instance, a questionnaire. An interpretive sociologist who is interested in understanding how people think use this method as an end in itself. It is a method of getting rich information on how people attach meanings to their behavior. I said clearly that different sociologists, the positivist and interpretivist, use the focus group interview for different purposes. The advantages of focus group interview. The focus group interview provides a more relaxed context where the respondents feel supported by others in the group. They are not alone with the researcher. It allows the group to help in the clarification of issues that the researcher may seek, rather than the onus falling on a single person. It gives more validity to the findings as the views expressed are shared by a larger group. I wish to draw your attention on what you should understand from this discussion. There are important ideas and conclusions that you should draw from this explanation. You will need the skills of evaluating the information and explaining how you make sense of the fact that there are so many conflicting views and opinions. In fact, in any study, whether in the social or natural sciences, there is often no consensus of opinion. The discussion on advantages and limitations show how sociologists from diverse approaches or perspectives have different ways of understanding or doing research. There is in fact no one best way of doing research in sociology, and for that sake, even in the natural sciences. We may draw attention to disadvantages, but each way of collecting data is good to some extent. It depends on whether you are a positivist or an anti-positivist, and what the researcher wants to do with the data obtained. We have many methods of data collection. We should make best use of the strength of each method and minimize the limitations. We can in fact make use of a combination of methods which we call triangulation, which we'll address in another lesson. Let us now recapitulate what we did. We looked at different types of interviews: structured, semi-structured, unstructured, and focus group interviews. We also addressed the advantages and limitation of each type of interviews, and we looked at how interview is used by different sociologists, and also what we should understand at the end of this lesson on interview. Let us now look at some of the questions you might get in the examination. What is a structured interview? 2 marks. Identify 2 types of interviews, 4 marks. Why do some sociologists prefer a structured interview? Or it could be semi-structured, unstructured, or focus groups. 4 marks. I have put it into brackets so as not to have to repeat the question over and over again. Differentiate between a structured and an unstructured or semi-structured interview, 8 marks. Explain 2 precautions a sociologist should take while conducting an interview, 8 marks. Discuss the problem of readability or validity, 10 marks. What is the best method of interview? 10 marks. How could a group interview be advantageous for the researcher? 10 marks. Assess the view that there are more limitations than advantages with interview. This is a 15 marks question where you have to give arguments for, against, and a proper conclusion. We have reached the end of this presentation on interview. I understand that in this short span of time of some 20 minutes, you might not have assimilated everything. If you need extra support or a copy of this presentation, please write to me on omvarma2011@gmail.com. Obviously, it will be free. The pictures and images used in this presentation are from open sources, unsplash.com and freemages.com. It was nice talking to you. See you soon, and for today, it's goodbye.